Ryan Stump presenting for us about PTSD. Dr. Stump did his undergraduate degree here at ETSU in history and went on to do medical school here and subsequently came to residency here at ETSU. With that, I'm going to go ahead and let him get started.
All right, so yeah, that's working. All right, so first I want to thank Dr. Elliott for agreeing to allow me to do kind of an unorthodox kind of grand rounds. So this is going to be a historical kind of topic with some, but I think has some good data in it that we can use when we look at shell shock today and have a better understanding of it. PTSD, which they are one and the same, at least I believe so. So, without further ado, the disclosure statement, I, Ryan Stump, have a financial interest, arrangement, or affiliation with one or more organizations that could be perceived as a real or apparent conflict with interest and context of the subject of this presentation. So, I'm going to start with, this is a short little poem here by J. Linger. He was a soldier, British soldier during World War I. So, the state takes away our responsibility but cannot ease our grief. We have to carry it alone, and it reaches deep within our dreams. So for those of people who aren't familiar with PTSD, I'm just going to run through some of the brief DSM-5 criteria. So of course, you have the person was exposed to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual threatened sexual violence. They'll have intrusion symptoms, and these can be nightmares that occur at night where they will relive the experience, or they can be flashbacks that occur during the day. Also avoidance. They very likely want to avoid crowds, open places. And these are the people that you'll often see who go buying their groceries at 1 or 2 at night. Negative alterations in cognition and mood. There's alterations in arousal and reactivity. They say you never have to be very careful when approaching a lot of our PTSD veterans because just the slightest noise or something that they don't recognize is going on around them can startle them. And it has to last for more than 1 month. If symptoms are under a month, then it's called acute stress disorder. So to have an understanding of shell shock and PTSD during World War I apologize, but being a history major, I do have to do a brief history of the war. So started July 28th, 1914, lasted November 11th, 1918. 2 major sides, the UK, France, Russia were the Allies, Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary. The US entered the war April 6th, 1917, and after the Germany declared unrestricted submarine warfare. And so a lot of our ships were being sunk. This is a map just to show you kind of where this went on, and you can see, you know where all the things, all the countries are. But this little bit of northeast France here is where all the majority of the fighting and dying occurred between France, England, and Germany. And this is a little blown-up version, and it shows the fronts. And as you can see, they don't go very far at all. This is a very different kind of war than what a lot of us are used to now, even in World War II. All right, so one of the main aspects, trench warfare. So this is an example of a trench that the soldiers would live and fight from. Both sides would have these trenches separated by, sometimes it can be a mile, but sometimes it would be as close as 50 meters apart. In between, you had this. It's called no man's land. Blasted shell holes, enter it, you die pretty much. As you can see, very muddy, full of barbed wire. During an assault, one side would rise up this, try to make it across that into machine gun and artillery fire. All right, so then the things about trench warfare that most of the veterans know or relive about. First off, I'm going to talk about the last thing on that topic there is about the smell. It was said that the new troops that were marching to the front could smell the front miles before they actually got there. As you can imagine, very poor hygiene. There's nowhere to go to the bathroom in the front of the battlefield, so the soldiers would have to, use the trench. your comrades, soldiers, dead bodies, they could not be safely buried. And so a lot of times they ended up in the walls of the trench, or you separated off one side. And then the mud, as you can see, when it rains, this is where you have to live. And that leads to a lot of problems, which we'll get to later on with health and sanitary issues. And one of the other issues is rats. This is from one night, where these are German soldiers who are showing their catch from. And the rats, as you expect, would bring all kinds of diseases. But another kind of disease and pest that they had was lice. It's estimated 97% of the soldiers had lice. And from that, you could get things like trench fever, which severe headaches, debilitating muscle pain, and pain in the shins. It can last for around 5 days, but it was also often relapsing. This is called trench foot, and this is what happens when you live in the mud without any change of socks, any change of shoes, for numerous days on end. So a lot of times it would lead to these blisters, gangrene, and eventually amputation. So new weapons. This was the first true modern war, which led to the use of modern weapons. The machine gun made its first debut, and a large-scale debut, and as also World War I was the first, and thankfully, conflict to employ chemical weapons. However, it's modern artillery that truly defined the conflict. As you can see from the picture, the sheer number of shells raining down on the troops made it easy to see why people thought that the psychological symptoms that we kind of view as PTSD were presenting from the constant bombardment of these shells and the damage it caused to people's brains. Just as an example, during one of the battles called the Battle of Verdun, the Germans, during the first two, fired over 1 million shells, which over a 25-mile front, and that's being 100,000 shells per hour. And the survivors said that it sounded like a drum line the entire time of somebody beating a drum, and that was the shells that were falling. All right, so the cost of all this war: 10 million soldiers killed, 7 million civilian casualties. On some days, you could have as high as 20,000 men die in one day. So the prevalence of PTSD during World War I, the British is where most of the data that we get comes from. The French also treated their PTSD, but did it in different ways, but most of the data and sources that I have and are able to find comes from the English. So the British had about 80,000 cases they termed war neurosis by the end of the war, and they estimated that between 5 and 20% of combatants suffered from PTSD or shell shock. So our friend Charles Myers was the first person who studied PTSD shell shock, and it was 6 months into the war. He was stationed in France at a medical unit, and in his report he saw 3 cases had similar symptoms, and this intrigued him, so he wanted to kind of learn about this, see kind of if it was similar. He reported that they all had reduced visual fields, loss of smell, taste, and loss of memory. So he said that it was definitely a class among a different type of that arises from the effects of shell shock. So it was at first, it was thought that the excessive blast of artillery shells caused these symptoms, and so initially the soldiers were given a wound stripe and were able to be discharged home or given a war pension. It should be noted that now that we're into the Iraqi freedom and Afghanistan, we have a lot of TBI cases coming through the VA, and it's really something that hasn't ever been looked at, but TBI would probably be quite prevalent here in this era as well, especially because none of the soldiers going into the war had any kind of metal helmets. So they were going into artillery machine gun fire wearing cloth hats. The Russians never had metal helmets, and it wasn't until a year or two in that the other powers did. So by the end of 1915, these men were starting to be viewed in a different light. Shell shock patients were viewed as having an emotional collapse in the face of war, and this was kind of the the view that was taken on by the public and the officers and military at the time. It was a convenient outcome as well for the governments, because if this disorder was psychological, then the men would be sent back to the front because they were not wounded and they did not have to pay them any kind of pay. So these are the symptoms described to us that was seen by Dr. Salmon, who was an American psychiatrist who in England and France during the war. So disturbances of psychic functions, delirium, confusion, amnesia, hallucinations, battle dreams, anxiety states, disturbances of involuntary functions, heart disorders, low blood pressure, vomiting, diarrhea, enuresis, retention of urine, dyspnea, sweating, disturbances of voluntary muscular functions, including paralysis, tics, tremors, gait disturbances, contractures, convulsive movements, and then special senses also lost. So as you can see, it is very similar, and I would say most certainly would be qualified as PTSD today. And because pictures can always speak louder than words, I'm going to show a couple videos of footage from men who were treated for PTSD, for shock during World War I. These can be disturbing for some people just because of what they show. Just a note of warning.
Only in November, when the weather turned bad. Shell shock represented a kind of mutiny. A personal withdrawal from an intolerable reality. Not all, or even most soldiers, suffered from shell shock. But those who did were sobering examples of what mechanized warfare could do to human beings.
Rifleman Arthur Russell was, or had been, a magnificent specimen of manhood, 6 feet tall. There was not a mark on him, yet he was helpless as a child. When I returned about a month later, I found Russell trying to walk. His speech was slowly returning, a slow, halting speech full of stammers. But I doubt if he ever again became a fully fit man.
The symptoms were often tied to an event on the battlefield. The soldier who bayoneted an enemy in the face developed a facial tic. This man responded to nothing, except the word bomb, which sent him scurrying under the bed. This French soldier became hysterical at the sight of an officer's red hat. Treatment for most enlisted men involved rest and recuperation.
And then one more, and this footage is from another guy we're going to talk about in just a little bit, Hurst, and he had a treatment facility in England. And this shows some of what happens after treatment as well. All right, so how was PTSD treated at that time? So at first, the cases of shell shock were treated in general military hospitals behind the lines of battle. Severe cases sent back to Paris, London, but again, no specific treatment was known at the time. And the prevalent view, public and the military, was that these men were actually cowards or malingers who just didn't want to be there. BBC reported that these men were met with silence upon returning home and marched there with their heads hung in shame, similar to what the Vietnam veterans experienced. It was reported that 4/5 of men at this early treatment phase who went into a hospital with PTSD symptoms never returned back to duty. So it was soon discovered that something had to be done different. The rates of these soldiers being evaluated with these symptoms kept increasing, and the armies had to do something different because they couldn't afford the loss of manpower. So between all of the Charles Myers, the man we talked about earlier, and then Salmon, the American, they developed a form of treatment that is pretty much very similar to what we use today. So treatment developed to include immediate treatment near the front, and then they went on to do extended treatment for severe cases toward the back. So immediate treatment started as soon as possible. If it was delayed, it would worsen very quickly. Thomas Salmon, the American military psychiatrist, wrote that the mental attitude, the patient's morale as a soldier, and his attitude toward his disorder will reach a very low level, is seriously impaired, and a chronic invalid will replace a temporarily incapacitated soldier. So patients were first sent to casualty clearing stations right next to the front. They were kept there for 7 days before being sent on to hospitals in the back. Captain Brown, a psychiatrist and one of the clearing stations, said that they could restore 66% of cases with what would be acute stress disorder. So the keys to this treatment: immediacy, proximity, expectancy, and simplicity. We already talked about immediacy, so proximity meant treating the patient right near the front line. They want the patients to be able to hear the battle in the background instead of evacuating them to the peaceful atmosphere at the rear, because once you go there, it is very unlikely that they will want to ever return. Expectancy referred to the positive expectation of prompt care, which was instilled into the patient by using persuasive psychotherapy. And then simplicity was that they use very simple methods such as rest, sleep, and psychotherapy that avoid exploring any childhood or civilian traumas, but focused instead on just the military. Medical officer Colonel Rogers of the British, he wrote that you must send your emotional cases down the line, but when you get these emotional cases, it's very, very bad. You have to, if you have a hold on these men and they know you and you know them, you are able to explain to him that there's really nothing wrong with him. You give him rest at the aid post, if necessary, a day or two sleep. Go with him to the front line, and with him there, see him sit down beside him, talk with him about the war, and let him look through your periscope and let the man see that you're taking interest in him. So it's just these very small things that made a big difference. So longer-term treatment, patients who had severe cases sent back to Paris, London. Here they were placed in the case of enlisted men, the regular soldiers, they went to the specialized psychiatric hospitals. Officers would be sent to smaller private centers. The most famous of these smaller private centers was run by Major Arthur Hurst, a general physician with an interest in neurology. And Hurst was the gentleman who had the footage that I showed you in the second video. Hurst at the time was considered very unorthodox. His treatments included hypnosis, persuasion, massage therapy, dietary treatments. He also staged large mock battles and had his patients shoot firearms. However, the mainstay of his program was occupational therapy and rest. This was all done at a peaceful resort in the country, so everything was quiet and peaceful. The occupational things that these men would be doing: farming, gardening, basket making, weaving, a lot of OT therapy here. And then on the wards, the patients were actually encouraged to write, and they even came up with their own gossip column called Ward Whispers. Hearst wrote that he could cure 90% of shell shock cases. H.R. Rivers, British psychiatrist who specialized in psychoanalysis, seen as a pioneer in his field, he came up with what he called the tolerant cure. Rivers decided that the neurosis was caused out of self-preservation. It was the reliving of the memories was such traumatizing experience that it made sense the soldiers would repress these thoughts during the day. However, they were still present and would come up when the patient was unconscious. So he proposed that the soldiers had to discuss their fears in order to process them. This sounds very simple and logical today, but at the time this was cutting edge. Not all psychiatrists were as compassionate. Louis Yayland, he was a psychiatrist who worked in Queen Square in London, described as a schoolmaster, authoritarian, and patronizing. His thoughts on shell shock victims were that they had three things in common: weakness of the will, negativism, and hypersuggestibility. So his treatments were suggestion, persuasion, and electric shocks. He also had devices that they would put on heads and have pegs that they could tighten for supraorbital pressure applied to the front of their heads for long periods of time. He was noted to have played on soldiers' greatest fear, being accused for malingering. He was quoted as saying, "If you recover quickly, it's due to a disease, but if you recover slowly, I should decide that your condition is due to malingering." And so this is how he proposed to get patients to get themselves better. So during World War I, 306 British soldiers shot for cowardice and desertion. Men were given a short trial. A tribunal reported they had medical opinions. Sometimes it was ignored, or sometimes it actually was accusatory. The one psychiatrist who didn't want to be named did write down that he went to the trial determined to give no help for, quote, "I detest his type. I really hoped he would be shot." So the British government, after much debate, officially pardoned all 306 of these men in 2006. One of the most famous of these, Harry Farr, British private, fought on the Western Front. He was sent back to a psychiatric hospital behind the lines in 1915 due to severe convulsions. He would then be sent back to the front after the convulsions stopped, but he would go back multiple times with similar complaints, but always sent back to the front. Finally, on October 1st, he refused to return to the front, was given a 20-minute tribunal, shot the following morning. His wife, Gertrude, recalled in a letter that while he was in the hospital, he would send her letters, but he shook all the time, and she said that he wrote that he could not stand the noise of the guns. They got a letter from him, and it was in a stranger's handwriting because he was shaking so well he couldn't hold the pen. And then of note, this cowardly man who didn't want to go to the battlefield refused his blindfold at the firing squad. And then the most famous psychiatrist of the time, military-wise, in the U.S. was Thomas Salmon. Salmon he went to England to study shell shock and to determine if the U.S. ever entered into the war, what we could do to help prevent this. So he wrote a very large article which helped the British come up with how they would do things. And much of his work is extremely similar to what we use today. In modern PTSD treatment, we have a lot of different things: CBT, exposure therapy, occupational therapy, reintegration work, medications, and EMDR. Except from here down, they did not have any medications that worked, and of course EMDR wasn't. But everything from here up was being done at the time. So what happened to PTSD treatment between World War I and modern day? Why is it that they had all these great ideas, things that we use today, but what was the disconnect? So after the war, most people kind of forgot about the shell shock. They determined that if shell shock was acute at the time, it was acute. So if anything happened afterwards, it was seen as pre-existing. and it was not thought to extend once the initial phase was over. When World War II started, the U.S. thought that they could stop or not have any psychiatric casualties by evaluation and screening. So they went through a complicated screening process where they tried to weed out anybody that had emotional breakdown potential. And we actually would not take 5 million men in the draft due to those evaluations. But a few years into the war, it was found that this didn't work. And of the 800,000 to 1 million American troops that actually saw combat during World War II, 37.5% of those had PTSD symptoms afterwards. All right, and also, by the time the Korean War started, again, the public perception was that this was a weakness of will. They called PTSD during the Korean War a weakness of character and operational exhaustion. However, during the first year of that war, 1/4 of all the troops in the theater were psychiatric casualties. Then it wasn't until after Vietnam that they recognized PTSD had longer lasting effects. The symptoms were assumed to be pre-existing, as I said. The National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study was a huge help in this matter. It was done in the 80s, and it concluded that 30% of Vietnam veterans had PTSD at some point in their lives, and that it occurred far, far after the acute stress. And so that is the end of the lecture with references afterwards. So, any kind of questions anybody has? All right. Well, we'll get out early on this cold day, and thanks everybody for coming in and listening. And